Jung's most treacherous revelation wasn't about psychological disorders. It concerned individuals who observe everything that escapes others' notice and the reason this capability annihilates them. Through his therapeutic work, Jung recorded cases of patients possessing what he termed enhanced perceptual awareness. These were people who could interpret subtle facial expressions, detect concealed emotions, and recognize psychological configurations that remained invisible to everyone else. They penetrated social pretenses, identified deception immediately, and experienced the unconscious conflicts present in every environment. Jung labeled this finding treacherous because these individuals invariably became alienated, depleted, and incapable of sustaining ordinary relationships. Not due to mental instability, but because perceiving everything carried a psychological price that nobody comprehended. But before we continue, please like this video, share it with people who might appreciate it, and write in the comments which city you're following our YouTube channel from. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most treacherous revelation about individuals who perceive everything, and why he believed this exceptional capability either annihilates you or converts you into something remarkable. The situation that exposed Jung's most treacherous revelation started with a patient he chronicled in his confidential records. A deeply introverted, intuitive individual who sought his help in 1913 during Jung's personal psychological turmoil following his separation from Freud. This patient, embodying what Jung would subsequently classify as the most uncommon personality configuration, possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive awareness. She could enter any space and instantly feel the psychological climate. Who was deceiving? Who experienced emotional suffering? Who concealed secret bitterness? Jung documented, the patient demonstrates an exceptional ability for detecting unconscious materials in others, yet this capacity seems to generate significant anguish rather than benefit. She couldn't participate in casual conversation because she saw beyond every social mask. She couldn't preserve friendships because people felt vulnerable and uneasy in her presence. She couldn't maintain employment because her existence disrupted the collective unconscious understandings that enable groups to operate. Jung recognized he wasn't addressing pathology. He was witnessing what occurs when the unconscious becomes excessively conscious, when awareness becomes too refined for social functioning. He recorded her describing individuals with shocking precision. She discusses others as though she possesses access to their intimate thoughts and concealed drives. When I confirm her perceptions through methodical inquiry, they demonstrate extraordinary accuracy. This wasn't mental illness or fantasy. This was consciousness so developed it had become socially hazardous. Yet Jung uncovered something even more troubling, because this patient's remarkable perception appeared impossible to rationalize. Consequently, Jung started examining what he would later identify as participation mystique, the psychological occurrence where individuals with highly refined intuition become flooded by unconscious materials from others. Jung recorded in his Red Book era notes, there exist those among us whose mental mechanism is so precisely calibrated that they absorb not simply conscious messages, but the complete unconscious environment of their surroundings. Contemporary studies by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive individuals confirm Jung's initial findings. Her investigations demonstrate that approximately 20% of people possess enhanced sensory and emotional receptivity. However, Jung identified something more particular within his psychological framework: the introverted intuitive configuration comprising roughly 1% of the population who don't merely feel intensely but perceive unconscious configurations with startling precision. Jung noted that these individuals possess what he called refined intuitive capacity. Their minds process not only apparent social signals but unconscious emotional conditions, suppressed material and psychological configurations that others cannot identify. They recognize the sadness behind artificial smiles. They detect the hopelessness beneath assured displays. They experience the collective shadow that groups unconsciously choose to overlook. Jung documented, the hazard exists not in the perception alone, but in the mental isolation it generates. When one observes clearly what others cannot or refuse to see, one becomes a reflection that society cannot endure to examine. This establishes what Jung called the dilemma of the superior capacity, when your greatest asset becomes your heaviest load because it distances you from collective unconscious involvement. But Jung discovered the genuine hazard wasn't the perception alone because individuals with highly refined perception observe others' unconscious materials clearly. Therefore, they become objects for what Jung thoroughly documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously assault them for reflecting what they decline to recognize in themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "Nothing possesses a more powerful influence psychologically on their surroundings and particularly on their offspring than the unexpressed existence of the parent." Yet he discovered this principle applied to all connections. When someone's shadow is mirrored back through another individual's clear perception, the unconscious mind faces two options: integrate the shadow or assault the mirror. Jung documented this configuration repeatedly in his therapeutic practice. The individual who observes clearly receives blame for generating the difficulties they're simply witnessing. His patients with refined intuition experienced this continuously. When they would gently indicate that someone appeared distressed, that individual would rage at them for being pessimistic or manufacturing conflict. When they'd voice worry about apparent difficulties, they'd be charged with being critical or fabricating problems where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't accidental. It was psychological protection. In memories, dreams, reflections, he documented, "Everything that disturbs us about others can guide us to an awareness of ourselves." Yet for most individuals, it's simpler to assault the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected. This establishes what Jung called the scapegoat occurrence. Highly perceptive individuals frequently become the identified difficulty in every group they join. Not because they generate difficulties, but because they expose difficulties that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed, "The carrier of superior perception becomes the container for all that the group cannot consciously recognize about itself." This configuration explains why these individuals don't simply feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by a force they cannot logically explain. Yet Jung's most disturbing discovery was yet to come because Jung observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals. Therefore, he identified four separate configurations within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different method of processing unconscious materials from others. Category 1. The feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with refined feeling capacity. These individuals don't simply observe what's occurring psychologically, they experience it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so thoroughly they frequently cannot differentiate between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. Jung documented, "The feeling intuitive exists in a condition of constant emotional transmission, experiencing the unexpressed emotions of everyone in their environment." Category 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals observe psychological configurations and predict behavioral results with shocking accuracy. Jung noted they could anticipate relationship failures, career catastrophes, and personal collapses months before they happened, not through logical examination, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted, "They possess an extraordinary ability to perceive the logical outcomes of unconscious processes that others cannot yet observe." Category 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could detect the physical expressions of psychological conditions in others, identifying illness before symptoms emerged, sensing exhaustion before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily stress that indicated emotional distress. Jung documented, "These individuals function as early alert systems for psychological and physical illness in their environment." Category 4. The pure intuitive. The most uncommon type. Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary capacity. They observed everything but experienced difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed, "They exist in a condition of constant overwhelm, receiving enormous amounts of unconscious information without sufficient psychological structure to process it constructively." Understanding your particular configuration is essential because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so treacherous. Because Jung observed the devastating impacts of undifferentiated perception on his patients. Therefore, he concluded that observing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine hazards to both individual and collective welfare. Jung identified three particular hazards that made this discovery so threatening. Hazard 1. Collective unconscious disruption. Jung documented, the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social unity depends. When someone observes through the shared illusions that bind groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain realities, they become a destabilizing influence. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partially through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Hazard 2. Psychological alienation. Jung documented how differentiated perception establishes what he called the dilemma of superior capacity. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, he documented, the burden of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This alienation isn't merely social, it's existential. These individuals frequently report feeling like they're existing in a different reality from everyone surrounding them. Hazard 3. Identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that individuals who absorb unconscious materials from others frequently lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they cannot distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a condition where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious materials. He documented, the hazard is not merely social exile, but psychological destruction, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not simply therapeutically important but psychologically urgent because unintegrated superior perception posed such hazards. Therefore, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious materials. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung documented, the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. Technique. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. Jung discovered that individuals who observe others' shadows clearly frequently do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by observing these qualities in others. Jung documented, everything that disturbs us about others can guide us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can observe clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological materials without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung documented, the individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious materials temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals. Therefore, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of Nietzsche, unintegrated perception. Jung was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse in memories, dreams, reflections. Jung documented Nietzsche's ability to observe through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of using his perception in service of healing, he wielded it as a weapon against society. Jung documented, Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they observe rather than transformed by it. The case of Meister Eckhart's successful integration. Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. Jung documented, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He observed clearly but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Jung's own integration journey. Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book. Jung documented, I was threatened by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients. His superior perception of unconscious materials, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him until he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. This realization transformed his approach to patients with similar gifts because individuals with superior perception frequently face isolation. Therefore, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Jung documented in The Development of Personality, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1, fellow individuated persons. Jung documented, the individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. Type 2, those engaged in individuation. Jung observed that individuals actively engaged in their own individuation process, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Jung documented, those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Type 3, natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol. Jung taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. 1. Begin with small, gentle observations. 2. Notice their response pattern to feedback. 3. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. 4. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. 5. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept everything you observe, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development. Therefore, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung documented in The Undiscovered Self, the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, people who help consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation. Stage 1. Recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. Jung documented, the beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be. Stage 2. Integration without isolation. The second stage involves learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. Jung observed the individuated person does not withdraw from the world but engages with it more consciously. Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer rather than a burden you carry. Jung called this conscious participation using your abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. Jung documented, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole. Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. The final stage involves what Jung called transcendent function, using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. Jung observed, the individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. The integration becomes cultural medicine. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They observe what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung documented, what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious materials conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail this transformation because the path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers. Therefore, Jung documented the most common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. Jung documented extensively about psychological inflation when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he warned, the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Jung called the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Jung observed, the moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. Jung documented cases where individuals used their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to be worth engaging, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wisdom. Jung documented, true individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it. Pitfall 3. The helper's high. Jung observed that some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to observe and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Jung warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role. Pitfall 4. The overwhelm return. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during periods of stress, trauma, or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded with others' unconscious materials again. Jung emphasized, integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. The integration maintenance Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological materials from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious materials. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Jung documented, the integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity. Because Jung understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development. Therefore, he viewed highly perceptive individuals as serving an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung documented, the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that individuals with superior perception serve as what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness, the historical pattern. Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their insights. They served as advanced scouts for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. Jung documented, what appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole. Modern manifestations. Jung believed that in the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns that explain collective behavior, environmental and social unsustainability before it becomes obvious, spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, technological implications that others haven't considered, collective shadow materials that need conscious integration. Jung's insight, the sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. The service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung documented, the individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. The ultimate integration. At the highest level of development, Jung observed, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, observing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they observe, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they witness. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who came to him during his own psychological crisis? After 3 years of working with Jung's individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological materials and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor where her differentiated perception helped troubled individuals. She built relationships with individuals who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious development. Jung documented her transformation. The patient learned not to observe less, but to observe more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most treacherous discovery, that some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you observe everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time, The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to observe everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most treacherous discovery wasn't that some individuals observe everything. It's that most individuals who observe everything never learn to use what they observe wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The danger of observing everything isn't that you observe too much. It's that you might never learn to observe with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals and Jung's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.